All right, good morning, everyone. This is Mrs. Rondo. We're going to be taking a look at some of the most missed questions from the Unit 4 test in preparation for retesting coming up soon. So our essential question, what do I need to practice in preparation for the Unit 4 retest? Our learning goal, I can demonstrate my learning on the Unit 4 assessment. Here we go. So the first thing is just a quick review of sine, cosine, and tangent. So before I even do anything with the triangle, I want to remind us about SOHCAHTOA. Okay, so SOHCAHTOA, I would definitely keep this handy when you are taking the retest. Remember, the first letter of each little grouping represents a trig function. S represents sine, C represents cosine, and T represents tangent. Then the other letters, the O's and the H's, stand for what sides of the triangle. So the O and H for sine, or the SO, this would be the opposite over hypotenuse. Then for cosine, we would have adjacent over hypotenuse. And finally, for tangent, we would have opposite over adjacent. So that's how to kind of make sense of SOHCAHTOA. If you have missed that for some reason, hopefully that helps a little bit. All right, so I'm going to go to my triangle here, and I'm going to mark the angle. I have the angle at theta. And so I mark that, and then I'm going to mark the sides of my triangle in reference to that angle. But first, the very first thing I'm going to mark is actually the hypotenuse. So the hypotenuse is the longest side, or another way to recognize it is the side across from the 90. So this one would be my hypotenuse. Okay, and it is the largest of the sides in a right triangle. Then from my angle theta, I'm going to shoot across here. The side across from the angle, or on the opposite side of the triangle, in this case the 4, we call the opposite because it's on the opposite side of the triangle. And then the last side we're going to label is down here, the 3. This side we call the adjacent because it is next to, or literally touches, the angle right here. So the one thing you do want to be careful of is not to mix up the hypotenuse and the adjacent, since both hypotenuse and adjacent touch that angle theta. So that's why I start by labeling the hypotenuse because it is the largest side and always across from the 90. So that one is already labeled. So the other leftover side, so to speak, is your adjacent. All right, and then we were supposed to here find the sine, cosine, and tangent for the given angle. So now I would do sine of theta, and based on my little SOHCAHTOA up there is going to be opposite over hypotenuse. My opposite is 4, my hypotenuse is 5. Then I would do cosine theta. This one from SOHCAHTOA, the cosine equals adjacent over hypotenuse, so 3 over 5. And then finally, my tangent theta is opposite over adjacent. Opposite is 4, adjacent is 3. All right, so that finishes that one. On to the next. This one was a very commonly missed problem, and I think the issue was the solving more than anything, not as much the setup. But let's take a look. A piece of plumbing pipe is leaning against a building as shown in the drawing below. What is the length of the pipe? Round to the nearest tenth. So we're going to go nearest tenth. All right, and they already have everything nice and labeled for us. So I'm just going to start by marking my angle, 58 degrees, and I'm going to label the sides that I have. And so I like to start with the hypotenuse if it is one of the sides we're interested in. Here I look and see, yes, my hypotenuse is something I want to know about, or I already know about. In this case, I want to know it's my x. And then I would figure out, all right, then what is the 10 feet? So I would try to decide, is it opposite or adjacent? And because the 10 feet is next to the 58, this is going to be my adjacent. Then I would go back and borrow SOHCAHTOA again and use that to help me decide which trig function to use. Which trig function is going to use hypotenuse and adjacent. We see that right here. So the trig function is cosine. So I'm going to do cosine 58 degrees equals adjacent over hypotenuse. So this part I feel like we probably did okay with, and then the part where we struggled is maybe the solving. So we're going to practice the solving. So in order to solve this, I have one fraction. I have the x in the denominator. It's really tricky to try to figure out what to do there. So I'm going to make two fractions by putting cosine 58 over 1. Then once I have two fractions, I'm going to cross multiply, do the love connection. Draw my fantastic heart here. Well, it's okay. Actually, I'm going to put that back in purple. All right, so I do the love connection. Sorry, that was supposed to be in purple. It's purple. Okay. So once I set that up, then I'm going to multiply. Remember, the whole point of the little hearts is the path. So 1 times 10 and bring it down is 10. X times cosine 58 is x cosine 58. But don't forget that this is multiply. All right, then I want to get x by itself. So I'm going to have to do some algebra here, some inverse operations. The inverse of multiply would be divide. So I'm going to divide both sides by cosine 58, because remember, I want the x by itself. And if I do that on the left, I got to do it on the right. Also, the trig function cosine always has to have some kind of angle with it. All right, so then these cancel out. So I have x. And then on this side, I'm going to have to go do some Desmos. So I'm doing 10 divided by cosine 58. All right, so I'm going to jump over to Desmos. And the first thing here that I'm going to do is I'm going to double check my settings in the top right corner. The graph settings, I'm going to make sure that I'm in degrees. Once I'm in degrees, I'm good to go. Then I'm going to go back over here, and I wanted to do 10 divided by, and then I believe that was cosine. I'm going to move this, move this guy out the way. This guy's in my way. Okay, so I want the keyboard here, so I'm going to go 10, and then, whoopsie, I'm in the wrong spot on my cursor. So up here, I want to say cosine of 58. And then as soon as I type that, I get 18.870. Okay. So that was 18.870 ... because there were way more decimals. I am rounding to the nearest tenth, as we mentioned before. So I'm going to round to 1 decimal place, which means I want to cut it off here. So I really quick look back at the 7. The 7 tells me to round up, so 8 becomes 9. So 18.9 degrees. All right, then this one, finding the measure of angle X. So I'm going to mark my angle X, and I'm going to immediately label my sides. Again, if I have the hypotenuse, I'm going to look for that first. So the 83 is my hypotenuse because it is across from the 90. And then I'm going to look at what is the 28. Is that opposite or adjacent? It touches angle X, so this one is going to be adjacent. And sorry, that's a little messy there. So it is going to be adjacent. So then I'm going to grab SOHCAHTOA. And once again, I'm going to check which trig function is going to use. In this case, I have A and H. I see it right here. I'm using cosine. So I'm going to set up my equation, cosine of, in this case, I don't have the angle. I'm calling it's angle X, so I can either put a theta or I can do a big X for angle X. That's fine. And then equals my adjacent, which is 28, over my hypotenuse, which is 83. So this one, I want to get X by itself, but I have to somehow get rid of the cosine, because remember that X represents an angle and it's stuck with the cosine. So the key here is going to be to get rid of cosine, or do the inverse operation for cosine, which happens to be cosine inverse. So I'm just going to rewrite my equation first really quickly. Oopsie. All right, so I rewrite the equation, and I'm going to inverse cosine both sides. So I do the little cosine with the little -1. That's inverse cosine on the left and inverse cosine on the right. Then cosine inverse and cosine cancel. I have X. I'm sorry, on the left. I don't know if I said right or left, but on the left, the cosine inverse and cosine cancel. On the right, I'm going to need a calculator. So I'm going to go back to Desmos. So 28 over 83. All right, so I'm on the same Desmos, so I don't need to check my settings. I'm just going to go to inverse cosine. That's again in my keyboard under functions, inverse cosine. And I believe it was 28 divided by 2. I forgot. Let me look really quick. 28 divided by 83. Right? Yes. Sorry, confusing myself. 28. Oopsie. You can see it got mad because I moved away. 28 divided by 53. I get 58.109. 58.109. And here I didn't give specific directions about how to round this. So if I'm rounding to the nearest whole number, I could round it to 58. If I'm rounding to the nearest tenth, which is what we often do, I would want to cut it off here. So I look back. The 0 tells me to round down or stay at the 1. So I get 58.1. That would be rounding to the nearest tenth. All right, the last one I want to look at is the one that had multiple parts, and we are only going to focus on the ones that were most missed, and that is the X and the Z. So the X and the Z on this one, again, you can pick whichever one you want to solve for first. I'm going to set up some trig to solve this. So I'm going to start with the angle I know, which is 74 degrees, and I'm going to label my sides. So right off the bat, the hypotenuse is across from the 90. So this is hypotenuse. Then from 74 degrees, if I shoot across on the opposite side of the triangle is X. So this is opposite. Then next to the 74 degrees would be, not hypotenuse, excuse me, adjacent is next to adjacent. Come on, honey. There we go. All right, and then again, I'm going to borrow SOHCAHTOA. SOHCAHTOA. Okay, and so I'm going to start with X. So if I'm doing X, I'm looking for opposite and hypotenuse because I want to find X and I know the hypotenuse. So those are the two sides I'm going to use, which is going to be the SO of SOHCAHTOA. So I'm going to use sine. So here's my equation. I would say sine of 74 degrees equals opposite over hypotenuse. Then when I go to solve this, there's multiple ways to solve, but I'm going to still stick with making this left side into a fraction. So I have two fractions with an equal sign. I can cross multiply, do the love connection. And so then I set this up nicely. I'm going to say equals 1 times x and bring it down is x. 125 times sine 74 is 125 sine 74. Make sure you don't accidentally multiply those numbers because you cannot multiply that number times the 74 because the 74 is the angle. All right, then at this point, all I need to do is actually put this into a calculator, 125 times sine 74. I'm going to go back to Desmos, 125. So I have 125, and then my functions, sine 74. And I get 120.12, I'm sorry, 157, 120.157. So 120.157, blah, blah, blah. On this particular question, I know that I asked for the nearest whole number. So if I round that to the nearest whole number, I want to cut it off, the decimal off right there. Sorry, there's my decimal, and this is where I want to cut it off. So I'm going to look back. The 1 tells me to round down or stay at 0. So I would get x equals 120. And then putting units on, that would be feet. Then the last one, finding Z, I could at that point do Pythagorean theorem, or I could do another trig equation. And since we are in the trig world, I'm going to actually do another trig equation. So I'm going to stick with the 74 degrees, and this time I'm going to focus on adjacent and hypotenuse, which is going to give me the cosine, because that is the ka of SOHCAHTOA. So I'm using the ka part this time, so I'm going to use cosine. And actually, I'll do this in a different color, even though I already wrote that. Let me just do it in a different color, just so we can keep it straight what's what. Okay, so I'll do it in orange. So again, we're doing the A and the H, because I want to find the Z. And so I'm going to do the AH of SOHCAHTOA, which means now I'm going to do cosine. So I'm going to set up cosine of 74 equals adjacent over hypotenuse, which is 125. So you can see this is a very similar setup to what we had a moment ago. I'm going to stick a 1 under this cosine 74, and then I'm ready to cross multiply, do the love connection. Sorry, that little heart was a little sad. Okay, and when I do that, sorry, 1 second. I get 1 times z, and bring it down is z, and then 125 times cosine 74. 125 cosine 74 degrees. Then I'm going to pop that into Desmos. So here we go, 125 cosine 74, which is very similar to what we had before, 125. And I'm going to do cosine and then 74. Oopsie, I missed the 125 part. Go back and put that in. 125. There we go. Cosine 74. I get 34.454. 34.454. Which, if I said that correctly one more time, would be 35.454. Again, the goal here was to round to the nearest whole number. So I look back. The 4 tells me to stay where I am. So I would get Z is 35. And again, tag on the feet. So that finishes the main missed questions. Definitely feel free to watch it again, look over it, make sure you're good to go, and good luck on the retest.